If you're just joining us, thank you for joining the June Broadband Advisory Board meeting. We'll get started at the top of the hour. We're waiting for a few more board members. We will have public comment today, so if you would like to provide public comment, you can let me know via chat or by raising your hand in the raise hand function in the reactions or right-clicking on your name. Thank you. Brian, if we want, we can start on time. We just don't have a quorum, so we can't do approval of the minutes, but we could start with a roll call and then go to the CBO update and survey if you're prepared.
Yeah, certainly happy to do that. Do I need to make a point of order that, or sorry, not, but do I need to make a note that Bob Pfeiffer is unavailable today? So I am as the vice chair, I'm chairing this meeting of the Broadband Advisory Board.
Thank you for doing that, Brian. Yes, Bob is unavailable today. So our vice chair, Brian Martin, will be chairing the board. We're missing Greg Winkler and I do not see Rick Garcia. So we do not have a quorum. So I can start with the roll call.
I think that's good. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. We're also missing, looks like, no. Okay. Antonio Martinez. See, he's here, but
I believe he is on mute.
Yeah. Okay. Jeff Kraft.
Morning.
Hi, Jeff. We've got Brian Martin, Jordan Beasley.
I'm here.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for joining us. Delilah Collins is out today. Do we have anyone from CDE joining us? Okay. Carrie Pycoach or Stephanie Bennett?
Stephanie's here. Sorry about that.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Morning. Catherine Keegan? I don't see her yet. Okay. Catherine Redhorse?
Good morning. I'm here.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for joining. And Jennifer Lewis, are you here as well?
This is Jennifer. Good morning.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for joining. Okay. And we've got Andy Frohard, right? Andy?
Yes, morning.
Morning. Okay. And it looks like we just got Greg Winkler.
Good morning.
Morning. Thank you for joining us. So now we have a quorum. Let me put up the meeting notes from last month's meeting. Just as a point for the public, these notes are put on our website directly after the meeting. It can take maybe a couple of hours, but usually they're up there directly after with the link to. We use recording to capture all of the discussion, but the basic motions are captured in the meeting notes. Okay, Brian.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So moving on to the next item on the agenda, the approval of minutes from the May 18th, 2021 Broadband Advisory Board meeting. Is there a motion, or does anyone have any questions, I think, before we proceed with the motion? Okay, doesn't sound like it. Can someone make a motion to approve the minutes as written?
So moved. Greg.
All right, Greg, thank you. Is this a second?
Second, Brian, this is Jeff Kraft.
Jeff Kraft. So Greg Winkler moves and Jeff Kraft seconds to pass the minutes as adopted from May 18th, 2021 Broadband Advisory Board meeting. Can we take a roll call or a vote? Is it all in favor, say aye?
Aye.
Any nays? Well, I had one vote.
We'll take it. We'll take it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, board.
Okay.
Okay, next item is the survey. Sarah, should I pass this on to you?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Brian. So as we mentioned in our last meeting, we We're putting together a survey to ask for direct feedback on the composition of the board, the topics, and the composition of the meetings themselves. We've decided to extend the availability of the survey up until next month so that we can gather more feedback. The survey is completely anonymous, so please do take it. It was in our newsletter, so if you are not on our newsletter, please put your information in our chat, in the chat for today, and I will make sure to get that ported over. But here it is on our Broadband Advisory Board website. All you have to do is click this link, and then just also point for the public. Under every meeting, there's the agenda once it's published, which it will be done. It will be available to, sorry, Megan, correct me if I'm wrong. Is it a week before the meeting or is it 2 weeks?
I think it's typically a week.
Okay, it's a week.
Maybe
before,
more.
so maybe more. So it's published on our website at least a week before. And then once the meetings happen, the meeting minutes and the recordings and presentations are put on our website available to view. So if you have any questions about that, you can feel free to email me and I can point you in the right direction. For updates from the CBO, we have our, we are going through a website process. As we've mentioned before, and Megan mentioned before, we're hoping to have a presentation of the new website sort of early fall for you all. So please stay tuned for that. If our website is suddenly down, that might be part of the problem as well. And then finally, we have our June Lunch and Learn, which is on the 22nd, and it's at noon, and it's with Arcadian Infracom. And they are a long haul, high capacity fiber optic cable company, and they will be giving a presentation. The Lunch and Learn is also now on the website under events. If you're ever looking for them, here they are. This is where all of our events are. So please feel free to go over there if you're looking for something. I think that's it for me in terms of, oh, I'm sorry, Megan, do you want to talk about data collection really quickly?
Sure. So our biannual data collection will start on July 6th, I believe. We collect data for about, I think it's 6 or 8 weeks. During that time, we collect and process data. I'll have to look up the actual date that for the deadline. I think it's the end of August. And then that data will be published in early October. Is there anything else you wanted me to mention about that, Sarah? Okay.
Oh, that's it. But if you do have any questions at any time, please reach out to our team. Data collection is really important to our broadband map, and we want to help make that process as easy as possible. I think that is it. I think we're ready to move on to public comment, Brian, if you are ready.
Super. Thank you, Sarah. So I'll just open it up to the public. This is 20 minutes where we give folks in the public stakeholders an opportunity to share their thoughts or concerns about whatever's going on that affects them and other stakeholders. So if there are anyone has any questions or would like to submit a public comment, I think you can send a note through the chat or then raise your hand through the Zoom feature and let us know when you are interested in participating.
I'll also say that in all of the presentations today, there will be an opportunity for the public to comment if they have questions. We're trying to make more time available for the public to participate in the collaborative process that we're undergoing here. So if you don't have public comment now that is not about something that is on our agenda, know that you'll have an opportunity to ask questions later.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Doesn't seem like there's any public comment, but we give it 10 more seconds. If anyone does have anything, please raise your hand through the chat and then and let Sarah know.
So Brian, it's Antonio, not a public comment, obviously, because I'm part of the board, but I did attend Action 22 last week. And one of the biggest questions from several of the county commissioners was that if they do get federal funding dollars in order to expand broadband within their counties, can they cross from one county to the next county on the same contract, or do they have to have separate contracts? So the answer for the public, for people to know that how this is being looked at by the Treasury and by the Federal Office of Management and Budget, is that you would be able to fund your broadband within your county up to your county borderline and then go into the next county. The specific counties that brought this up were Chaffee County and nearby, I believe, was Fremont. But they had some concerns about whether they would be able to connect. And the way it would be done is likely we would have a matching fund amount. So counties would do about half or more of the matching funds. Then we'd have federal matching funds to help to maintain that contractor, that ISP, to provision across county lines. So if there are any questions on that, I'd like to hear from the public comment section right now if anyone has had any concerns about doing a build out of a larger broadband across county lines.
Thank you for sharing that, Antonio. That's really helpful. Yeah, open it up to anyone who has comments. There is a comment request that has just come through, but I just want to give that time for anyone to ask Antonio questions.
So to answer Antonio, this is Mark Falconer, Larimer County. Yes, everyone who's trying to build out broadband is going to be dealing with border issues with funding, not just with other counties, but potentially municipal boundaries. So this is an area I'm particularly interested in. The other thing we're interested in a county is any kind of collective response we can give back on ARPA funding limitations around broadband speed. I think this has been a topic you've discussed in the past, but I'm just trying to understand if there's a coordinated effort to provide a more valuable comment back on the ARPA funding to try to raise the broadband limit for what's considered underserved communities. So that's our comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can tell you that they're working on the final rule. We've got the interim final rule information out from the Treasury Department, which does get to have the states' comments back, and all the states, all 50 states, comments back to it. So when we get the final rule, that'll give us more specificity, Mark. But yes, we are the CBO, as the broadband office, we are the central point that's trying to make sure that we are coordinating with the federal funding with ARPA.
Brian, this is Teresa Ferguson, jumping into the conversation. Hello to those who don't know me. I'm Teresa Ferguson. I'm Director of Federal Broadband Engagement for the Colorado Broadband Office. I work for Antonio, and I wanted to respond to the question about questions. In my comments today, in a few minutes, I'll provide you with an email address that all parties, all applicants, all potential applicants, or all interested parties can file questions with the U.S. Treasury through an email address that they have put out publicly. And I would suggest any questions you do have to go directly to them to get those answers as quickly as possible. They will be issuing final rules with regard to the state and local funding from ARPA soon.
Thank you, Teresa. I believe there are two other questions. Eric Hiddle has his hand up, and there's a question in the chat from Ralph Brown.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. This is Eric Hiddle from Archuleta County Broadband Services Manager Office. In reference to the comment that Antonio made, I can see how that, for an actual build would come into play. What I'm kind of curious about is that always something that we're looking at, especially with relation to ARPA monies, that we would need to look at from county to county border situations. If it's not a build, but rather a lease, we're rather isolated, and we, as discussed, I think in some previous meetings, are looking at trying to get some of our isolation issues solved by the current CDOT build that's going over Wolf Creek Pass, and we're pursuing a lease. The county itself is from Pagosa to South Fork. It's about a 43-mile length. Only about a third of that is in Archuleta County. The rest of it is in Mineral County, and it's a lease entered into by our county. So I don't know how that would work exactly, since it's a contractual lease and it's already built, or part of it is and part of it isn't yet. But it would be definitely crossing borders, and definitely that looks like a good use of our ARPA funds. But I don't know how we haven't even engaged Mineral County on doing that. I don't know how that contract would work. So are we talking about more like build out of new fiber infrastructure? Are we talking about things like this that would be crossing borders, but not necessarily a new build?
Yeah, so the CDOT lines do cross county borders because they're state projects. So that's not the issue that was brought up to me by the commissioners. The issue that was brought up to me was if we were to fund directly with contractors to ISPs and want them to bring, for example, that example from Kansas City, Fremont County up through Chaffee, up to Buena Vista, they have a concern about whether the county can use its fundings for its side, and then Fremont County uses its funding for its side. So the two counties have to find a way to coordinate to run the line through. And so basically it would be some type of matching funding where each county would pay a portion, and then the overall ARPA funds would fund the full contract for the ISP to build across county lines. So I didn't realize it was such a concern, but several commissioners brought it up. So I wanted to make sure people are aware that we're tracking it, and we'll work with the feds on the ARPA funding.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Antonio.
Any other comments?
We have 5 minutes left for our public comment before we need to move on.
I believe Megan took the initiative to answer the question from Ralph Brown, but I just want to make sure Ralph has the opportunity to share his thoughts. Ralph, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? And please let me know if I'm missing anyone. So we don't want to not be inclusive.
In reference to the questions regarding who is included in this process, if there is a group that needs to be included or invited or wants to give a presentation, please do contact me. I've put my email in the chat. I'm happy to schedule time to provide space on our agenda for presentations, but you can also fill out our survey online again and include individuals or organizations that you feel like need to be included.
I saw Girish's message about having the Broadband Minority Initiative talk about inclusivity. That would be really interesting. So yeah, I think the Broadband Advisory Board would certainly love to host a presentation on that. Great. Any other thoughts? Any other public comments, I should say? Okay, so I think we can probably move on to the next session. Sorry, next line item on the agenda. That's the digital literacy and inclusion. Any questions? This is coming from Catherine Keegan. Catherine, are you with us?
Yeah, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm just here to provide a brief update on the subcommittee on digital literacy and inclusion. I will send a chat to Sarah with a link to our new website under CDLE's Office of the Future of Work, which I direct. We have a specific subpage for our digital literacy and inclusion efforts, where you can find meeting materials and other information related to our projects on digital literacy and inclusion for your future reference. And then I'm working with Megan to make sure it's part of the update to the Broadband Office website that was already mentioned. I wanted to just update everyone on the progress so far. We've had one full subcommittee meeting, and we've had one set of working group meetings. So as a reminder, we have 3 working groups as part of that subcommittee. One is focused on policy, one is focused on data, and the third is focused on promising practices. The policy group will be working between now and December to develop a list of policy recommendations to inform the Broadband Advisory Board that are focused specifically on digital skill attainment and access to technology. We won't be providing policy recommendations on broadband funding, as that is very much in the purview of this board and the Broadband Office. So that is one of the working groups. The second working group focused on data will be exploring ways we can measure digital skill levels and digital literacy levels across the state so that we have a measure and a baseline to start to measure ourselves against year over year as a state as we try to improve digital literacy rates and digital inclusion. And so that data working group is focused on that. And then the promising practices working group is thinking about models that exist in the state already at the local level, best practices that exist across the country and across the world related to building those digital skills needed for work, learning, and participation in daily life, as well as access to technology, to think about how we could support our local digital equity ecosystems, as well as think of some statewide initiatives to make sure everyone is aware of best practices connected to each other and aware of these issues across the board. So those working groups of the subcommittee will meet monthly, while the overall subcommittee meets bi-monthly, with our next meeting coming up next week on the 22nd from 10 to 11:30. And so if you want to register for those, they're open to the public, they are recorded. And there's ways to get involved if you are interested, or if you know of others that should be involved, please don't hesitate to reach out or submit a form on that website to get the invites and get involved. So happy to answer any questions or get any feedback, but just wanted to provide that quick update to you all.
Thank you, Catherine. Are there any questions? And you said the registration is on the website, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. You can email me, or I'll drop that link to the chat, or Sarah on my behalf will drop that link to the website, and you can submit a form there, and we'll get you all registered.
Thank you. Teresa did submit a question. I'm not sure if it was covered, but are there any readouts along the way between now and December?
Yeah. So the first meeting just took place for the working groups, and then next week we're going to be updating the overall subcommittee. And so as we have those subcommittee updates, I can do more formal readouts to this Broadband Advisory Board, and we'll also be reporting on it in the Future of Work newsletter. We're expecting to get sort of the draft recommendations done by October, so we can have the overall subcommittee review them and also have this board review them before we finalize them in December. So there'll be plenty of opportunities. If you want more opportunities to hear about what's going on and the specifics that are discussed, please let me know, and I'm happy to provide more information.
Thank you. Does anyone have any further questions for Catherine?
Just the next subcommittee meeting.
Great, thank you. Thank you for doing that, Sarah. All right, I think we can probably move on to the next agenda item. That is the federal funding update, I believe, from our wonderful Teresa Ferguson. Teresa, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. Good morning. Also, I think we're still in morning, board members. So as Brian indicated, I'm Teresa Ferguson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of Federal Broadband Engagement with the Colorado Broadband Office. And I've been asked to join you this morning to share and provide a readout of the status of the various federal agencies' rollout of the American Rescue Plan Act, or as we all like to call it, ARPA. So when you hear that funny term ARPA, you know that's what we're referring to. And so specifically, we'll be talking about the ARPA funded broadband programs this morning. So Congress did include several provisions in ARPA that address broadband deployment, digital inclusion, and broadband affordability through direct appropriations to federal agencies. Colorado's benefit from these programs will depend on how many Colorado project proposals are submitted and how they stack up against applications from across the country. And in some programs, it will depend on how many qualifying customers or eligible applicants actually participate. So remember, this money isn't coming directly to the state. We are participating alongside all of our other states in competing for this money, for most of it. Program guidance and application windows are still rolling out for some of these programs that I'm going to go over with you today. But for now, here's what we know about the programs and the eligible applicants, and what they can, who the eligible applicants are and who can apply for what. So the first program I want to go through is the $3.2 billion Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, or the EBB. I'm sure many of you have heard about this, but for those maybe that haven't, the EBB provides eligible households with a discount off of the cost of broadband service of up to $50 monthly and up to $75 monthly for eligible households located on tribal lands. There is also a one-time $100 device or laptop discount as well that can be received as a part of participation in this program. On June 8th, the FCC designated the administrator, the Universal Service Administrative Company. They announced the launch of the EBB tracker. Now, this Emergency Broadband Benefit Tracker provides program metrics and state-specific participation data. Since the launch of the EBB program in mid-May, more than 2.5 million US households have enrolled in the EBB program to get broadband service or to stay connected. The 2.5 million US households represent over 2.4 million non-tribal and over 67,000 tribal households. 33,485 Colorado households are now benefiting from the EBB program. This represents approximately 1.6 million in monthly federal funding paid directly to internet service providers connecting our most vulnerable Colorado households. The tracker will be updated weekly, providing the number of households enrolled, including state-by-state participation figures, as well as the remaining program fund balance. Now, the reason that program fund balance is so important is because we want to be able to notify the participants as the fund is winding down so they can get out of the program so they aren't charged for something they can't afford. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that one and updating the CBO website with that information and this body, this board. The next program is the $7.2 billion Emergency Connectivity Fund, or the ECF. The ECF program was established by Congress to help schools and libraries close the homework gap by providing funding for devices and connectivity for off-campus use of students, school staff, and library patrons. The Universal Service Administrative Company announced yesterday that they will open the first funding window later this month. The ECF will fund the reasonable costs of laptops and tablets, Wi-Fi hotspots, modems, routers, and broadband connectivity services for the upcoming 2021-22 school year. The USAC has scheduled a number of outreach and training webinars over the next week, and I can provide links to those for you as well, but you can go to the USAC website for the ECF and see that they have webinars on the 16th, 17th, and then again on the 23rd. They will also provide those recordings later, so you'll be able to see that if you can't participate at those times. The next federal agency that Congress made significant appropriations to is the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or the NTIA. On May 19th, the NTIA announced the release of the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Here's another one of our alphabet soups. This is the BIP program. The NTIA will be accepting applications for the BIP grant through August 17th for this $300 million ARPA-funded grant program. So eligible applicants for the BIP grant include covered partnerships. Now, covered partnerships is a new definition that the NTIA has come up with, but it is defined as a partnership between a state or a political subdivision of a state and a provider or providers of fixed broadband services. So eligible applications must be for areas with populations of under 50,000. The NTIA allows each state to define what a political subdivision is by their own state standards. You can find links to the BIP program application details in the Colorado Broadband Office's June newsletter, as well as the May 27th Broadband Stakeholder Call follow-up email from Kate Sneed. The BIP resources that we've included in these various outreach efforts includes the notice of funding opportunity. The NTIA has released a couple of FAQs on this program. There's a press release on the BIP, and there are also recorded webinars and registration links for upcoming future webinars for the BIP program. But to give you just a little bit of an overview here, the NTIA is going to evaluate any BIP grant applications according to the ARPA defined project prioritization, which what ARPA said, what the statutes actually said, is they need to fund the projects that serve the greatest number of households, that are very rural, that are the most cost effective, and that if that project must provide a proposed solution of at least 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up. So the next NTIA grant program is the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Fund, or the Tdcp. On June 3rd, NTIA released the notice of funding opportunity for the TBCP to expand broadband access and adoption on tribal lands. The NOFO reflects input collected during 3 tribal consultations. Those consultation sessions NTIA had scheduled to seek input directly from tribal leaders. The tribal consultation sessions had a total attendance of about 844 people, with approximately 165 tribes represented. NTIA also received written comments from 58 tribes and/or tribal organizations, and applications for this program are due September 1st, so not a lot of time. Grants will be made available to eligible Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian entities for broadband deployment, digital inclusion, workforce deployment, telehealth, and distance learning. There are additional resources that you can find at the NTIA website for the TBC program. There's a fact sheet and webinars to be held tomorrow and on Thursday, and those recordings will also be made available. The next federal agency I want to cover quickly is the USDA. They had 2 broadband programs that were funded with ARPA funding that are active or have recently closed. The ARPA provided about $635 million for this next round of funding, but the USDA had some additional funding left over from previous cycles, which they are combining. And so we expect to see about $1 billion available for the next round of USDA Reconnect broadband loan and grant cycle. We don't have anything new to report. The NOFO release date isn't out yet. We're still expecting that in possibly August, and then potentially a window opening in September or October. So stay tuned on this one. It's a big opportunity for last mile broadband grant projects, and we're watching that one very closely. 60 million was appropriated to USDA through ARPA for their distance learning and telemedicine grant. That application window closed on June 4th, and Colorado had 1 application for 150,000 for the 2021 cycle. So finally, I'm going to wrap up here with the U.S. Treasury. On May 10th, the U.S. Treasury released the interim final rules for $350 billion in ARPA funding for state and local fiscal recovery funds. Treasury guidance, fact sheets, quick reference guides, and FAQs are all on the Treasury's website. We've also included those in the CBO's newsletter, I believe. And the Treasury issued a number of questions in those interim final rules. So when I spoke up earlier, when Antonio was talking about his conversations recently, this is the point in my remarks that I want you to pay attention. where you can get that email to send any questions you might have. But I did want to highlight a couple of the questions that were in the interim final rules. So the interim final rules ask these kinds of questions. They said, what are the advantages and disadvantages of setting a minimum symmetrical download and upload speed of 100 megabit? What other minimum standard would be appropriate and why? They ask, would setting such a minimum be impractical for particular types of projects? Or what are the advantages and disadvantages of setting a minimum level of service at 100 meg download and 20 meg upload in projects where it is impractical to set a minimum symmetrical download and upload speed of 100 meg? So those are just a few of the questions that were posed in the interim final rules. And if you want to reply to those questions, you can submit your questions through an email at slfrp@treasury.gov, and I'll put that in the chat in a moment. But the deadline for submitting those questions or asking questions to Treasury is coming up quickly. It's July 16th. So make sure if you have specific questions like boundary, county boundaries and things of that nature, just make sure that you submit those as quickly as possible to that email address. The ARPA appropriated $10 billion to Treasury for payments to states, territories, and tribal governments to carry out critical capital projects that directly enable work, education, and health monitoring, including remote options in response to the public health emergency. So guidance for the $10 billion Capital Projects Fund is expected to be released very soon. Don't have a date on that yet, but I'm kind of thinking, since the Treasury put a deadline of July 16th for questions on the interim final rules for state and local, they may wait to gather all that information before they issue their capital projects rules. They may not. So we're waiting every day to hear anything on this particular funding mechanism and to hear from Treasury in guidance that they're going to provide. But the Treasury has provided an email address that you can submit questions to anytime. It's capitalprojectsfund@treasury.gov. So that's all I really have for now. Sarah and Brian, we're going to continue at the CBO to track the progress of these programs, and we'll update the CBO website and provide this body with additional updates as those are made available. But I thank everyone for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Teresa. So we got about 5 minutes for questions, and just start with the board. Are there any questions from board members? If there are none, we can open that up to the anyone who's attending the call. Any questions for Teresa?
Hey, Teresa, are the questions that you've mentioned posted somewhere on the website? I don't remember seeing those.
Where they are, Mark, is they are located in the interim final rules themselves. Let me see if I can pull up right now the link to those interim final rules. If I can't, Mark, I'll go track them.
That's great. We're trying to propose a comment, but if it's probably more impactful if it's against a question that's relevant. So.
Understood. Mark, I will find that, and I'll mark I have the very long rules that were the interim final rules that were posted to the Federal Register. So it's kind of hard to give you page numbers. You may have a different document than I do. So I'll try to track that down and just show you what paragraph it's in, okay?
Thank you.
Hey, Brian, it's Jeff. I will jump in with a question. Teresa, you're going to say this is a totally unfair question. But it's okay. I'm going to be speaking next. You can zing me back with an unfair question. But my question for you is sort of looking at the whole collection of federal programs that you've talked about and sort of Colorado's likely ability to leverage those programs and the dollars that we're spending or that we potentially you think might be able to spend. And then, obviously knowing that there could be the infrastructure package coming later, which would make obviously a bigger difference. How much of the broadband problem within Colorado do you think we might be able to solve over the next 2 years based on sort of state and federal resources, just like a ballpark range? I know it's not a fair question. But like
I can always count on you, Jeff, to give me the hard ones. Okay. So, the way I started out the way I started my remarks, I'll follow up with that, right? That those first three programs, the money going to the FCC, the money going to NTIA, and the money going to USDA, we have no guarantee of getting any of that money, right? It depends on how many of the eligible applicants apply for it. So that is, I've since December 27th, I've been Debbie Downer. I have been saying, unless we participate aggressively, internet service providers, communities, and consumers, unless they participate aggressively in these programs, there's, I think I rattled off close to what, $12 billion there that Colorado won't see. Now the US Treasury's 350 billion state and local fiscal recovery funds, that has some opportunities there. That's going to be left to the legislature and the governor's office on how they're going to appropriate, Colorado's portion of the state money to close that broadband gap. So, in this session, we received about 75 million to be able to use that for middle mile and last mile funding. So I think it's a nice down payment. We'd like to see more. And then the 10 billion in the capital projects fund, that will result in about 171 million being available directly to the state of Colorado. But again, that will go through the legislature and the governor's office for them to look at how they want to address the use of those funds. So, you ask a hard question, and I'm just trying to lay out how certain we are that we get the money. Those top three, no certainty. The US Treasury pieces, that's going to depend on how our legislature and our governor wants to direct those funds. And then as far as the big infrastructure bill, you're probably reading the same headlines I'm reading. They're struggling. And so, there's numbers all over the park and all over the field, somewhere between 40 billion and, the president's proposal of 100 billion. Now, any of those numbers would do significant benefit or provide significant benefit to the state if those funds were directed to infrastructure deployment for the state. And so I answer your question kind of with a question. We won't know till we know how the legislature deems we should use these funds, and or if we can get an infrastructure bill package passed. I know Senator Bennett's been working on that for the last year, trying to get a package that would get Colorado somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 million. And we think that would fit very nicely with the what we need to be able to close that gap.
And Teresa, let me chime in here. So Jeff, it's about the third time in the last week I've heard it couched as Colorado's broadband problem. Colorado does not have a broadband problem. One thing that our team does, and we just did this yesterday with Megan, is we analyze how competitive we are against other states for many of these program dollars. We looked at EBB yesterday, and Colorado was rather competitive. In fact, we're still out there competing towards the top percentage of states trying to get the resources. So we're going to continue to do that. And our office will continue to advise people to make sure that they're actually applying and actually trying to get after the funds. But we want to make sure that every entity within the state that's eligible for these programs knows about it, has the awareness, and is able to apply. The second part of what Teresa's talking about is true. You can read it in the papers right now. That infrastructure bill is losing the dollar amount total. Every successive meeting that they have, the one that Mitt Romney just came out with last week, would reduce the amount of funding states would get for broadband. So we'll keep an eye on that. We'll keep tracking that, but we'll keep executing it. But I don't see it as Colorado's broadband problem. There's not a problem. In fact, the data I've seen for our rural outreach and our rural growth is that in every successive year, we're continuing to get better and better broadband services out there. So the goal for our office and for all of us should be that we continue to improve upon that in each successive year.
Hey, thanks, Teresa and Antonio. I really appreciate your context there. Very helpful.
We've got about another minute, if I'm not mistaken, just to take on any questions. Does anyone else have any thoughts, comments on this? Okay, we'll move on to the next item, and I just want to apologize publicly to Kate Sneed. I was looking at the wrong agenda and I skipped her. So next up, even though it was previously was supposed to be a legislative update and the opportunity to take any questions. Kate, I'll hand it over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think, yeah, great, perfect. Sarah's pulling up the legislative summary for me. I will make sure that this is sent out to the board, and also it was sent out last week in my stakeholder meeting, and we will post it on the website. But this is just a brief overview of the major pieces of legislation that went through this year around broadband. I'm just going to do a really quick highlight and ask and take time for questions. There's a lot still in the works on implementation on this, so this is really just what the bill tells the state to do, but not necessarily how we're going to implement it yet. So Senate Bill 60 has OIT, the Colorado Broadband Office, use $5 million of the federal dollars to create a program for make access more affordable by reimbursing subscribers for costs of service, and that we have is a requirement that we contract with a nonprofit that does similar administration for utility programs. So we'll be in the future coming out with much more information on that and how we will implement that. If you can scroll down for me. Senate Bill 72 is a change. It's really a utility bill, but it changed the definition in John Saunders from CCOM helped me explain it well last week, that it allows the companies to be included in some of the extensions and things that were created in Senate Bill 19-107. Senate Bill 103 is the sunset bill, or a bill for the Office of Consumer Counsel, and they added into this that the Office of Consumer Counsel within DORA has the authority to intervene in matters before the Public Utility Commission around telecommunication services, and so that is a duty that they have that's been added to that office. House Bill 1109 was one of our big bills, moves the Broadband Deployment Board from DORA to OEDIT, shrinks the board to 11 members, creates the request for proposal process, and requires mapping for anyone who wants to participate in the state broadband granting process. If you want to write a first refusal, appeal applications, apply for grant funds, etc. If you can scroll down for, Sarah's been controlling this, is that right? Sarah, can you scroll down for me, please? Thank you. It also will require some new reporting requirements for those who are grant recipients around speed testing and performance of the system after the grant application or after the grant monies are spent. So again, all that around how that will be administered, rules, etc., are yet to come as we work with Brian to administer all these changes. And then keep scrolling for me. $1289 was the state stimulus turned into federal stimulus package. That is the bill that gives $75 million for broadband investment, 35 for last mile to the board, 20 to the tribal nation, Tola, and for the middle mile and 5 to this new program created in Senate Bill 60 for reimbursement of costs for accessing internet for low income. It also is the bill that codified the Colorado Broadband Office in statute and make sure that we will continue to operate. So those are the significant pieces of legislation around broadband. Again, I will make sure that this document is available to be shared, but I'm also happy to answer any questions, mainly just on the legislation. Again, we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to administer and all of these things that is yet to come, but I'm happy to answer questions on any of the pieces of legislation and what they require.
Thank you, Kate. This is a really, really helpful document. I know I've been certainly using it quite a bit. Board members, do you have any questions you want to pose to Kate?
I would just make a comment to thank Kate for all the hard work she did this year. This has been quite challenging, and she's been up to the task. So thanks very much.
Second.
Thanks, Greg.
Are there any general questions folks have about legislation or this document? All right. I think, folks can certainly reach out to Colorado Broadband Office if they have any questions. And obviously all of our respective agencies are working very hard to make sure we can implement all the requirements successfully. So thank you very much, Kate. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, reach out with questions.
Super. All right, so moving on to the last item, OEDIT presentation and taking any questions. This is with Jeff Kraft and Mike Landis. Jeff, I shall hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And it seems like you guys do have me up on, I'm just checking you guys have me up on the screen. Thanks a lot. And Mike won't be here today, but I will mention him. Mike's on my team, and I'll mention some of his roles during the course of the presentation. And I guess, so my name is Jeff Kraft. I'm the Director of Business Funding and Incentives at OEDIT, and also the Deputy Director of the agency. And it's great to be here. Just a little background on me too, is I used to be, I say used to be, it's been a few years, but I was a telecom guy. My career before economic development was working for both doing public sector consulting on regulatory issues, but then also doing business to business marketing in the wireless industry. So definitely have a lot of experience in telecom, but will admittedly say it's sort of 10 years stale. So I'm not up on things like, the people that are working on day to day on the details, but broadband for OEDIT, it's really a two-part thing. I mean, when we first talked about doing this presentation, is how does OEDIT support broadband? And so that's in my title, but probably even more important than our support, and I will talk about some of the support mechanisms, is we really rely on broadband as a core piece of our economic development strategy, particularly for rural Colorado. And I think Antonio makes a really good point. I mean, broadband, it's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity we're really excited to keep moving forward in Colorado. But I will talk a little bit about the support we do. Our support is really small. We're kind of a minnow in this player compared to DORA, the Broadband Office, CDOT, and our friends at DOLA. So you guys do more in terms of directly supporting broadband than we do. We really rely on it, but we have a couple of programs. But I'm excited to talk to you and happy to take questions, and feel free to put them in the chat as you like, and take questions at the end as well on any piece that's worth following up on. So we'll go to the next slide here, if you don't mind advancing for me. Thank you. Yeah, so as I was saying, it really is a key enabler for OEDIT and our economic development partners. And really, when we think of economic development, there's a range of partners, and a lot of pieces go hand in hand with economic development. Housing goes hand in hand with economic development. And we also have so many partners, really all of the regional economic development organizations. There's ecosystem sort of empowerment organizations like Startup Colorado that's supporting rural entrepreneurial dynamism, local economic development entities, and they could be city, county, regional, or public-private, or even private nonprofit entities like chambers of commerce. And so you'll see I've listed that we do have what I'd say is 3 sort of broad classes of programs, and I would add in with enterprise zones, opportunity zones in there. But we have sort of zones that provide tax credits for various types of investments that could incentivize broadband. And then I mentioned Cdbg infrastructure grants. And let me first say that that's a DOLA program. But there's a person who runs sort of the economic development side of Cdbg, Community Development Block Grant Funds from HUD. Allison Anderson, used to be Bob Todd, many of you probably know him. She actually is a DOLA employee, but she physically sits a chunk of her time with OEDIT. And so we coordinate some of the economic development efforts she did. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So I called that an OEDIT program, but it's really a DOLA program coordinated through OEDIT. And then there's really maybe most importantly, the work that our rural opportunity team does. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But the core point is our OEDIT strategies are largely around, in rural Colorado, economic diversification, location neutral employment, and those really rely on broadband as an underlying must-have, a necessary but not sufficient condition for the rural economic diversification. So we are, in a sense, customers like a lot of other entities are of broadband. So we'll go on to the next slide here as well. So here's some of our strategies that really rely on broadband in this next section. And these are pretty detailed slides. I won't go through them in full detail, but you can look at these and we'll be happy to send them around. But we have a business services, business support team that's run by my colleague, Glenn Plagens. And under that team, there's a rural opportunity team. And we have a few people interspersed around rural Colorado to help drive rural strategies. And so this is some strategies that this rural opportunity team is doing. They're promoting certification for remote work through CSU Global. So they'll do both employee and employer certification. And there's also a lot of work we do with what we're called growth or second stage companies via our local economic development partners and Colorado Companies to Watch and sort of philanthropic organizations like Energize Colorado to work on supporting remote employee job fairs. So a lot of times, you might read in the Denver Post or the Denver Business Journal that OEDIT is incentivizing a company, often it's a technology company, to come to the Front Range. Many of them are coming from the Bay Area and opening second offices here in Colorado. And we have a program now that they can come to Colorado and they can get incentives for hiring employees anywhere in Colorado. But if they're willing to hire remote workers in economically depressed rural areas, we'll add an extra incentive on top of that. And we're starting to see some traction and some uptake. And it's hitting our definition of rural for that program is fairly broad. So it would include, for example, Grand Junction, which some people might say, well, that's a small metro area, but that's in our rural world. But there's also a whole set of education, technical assistance, and implementation programs to rural communities and rural economic developers. We're really trying to support and leverage co-working spaces and remote satellite offices. And obviously a co-working space could be an answer if you have broadband there, but not in your residence. It could enable you to be a remote rural worker. So we're trying to think through those things. And so I think I've hit on most of those incentives, but we really are pushing for remote rural workers as well as other economic development and diversification strategies through OEDIT. So I think you'll see that's a pretty consistent theme that's happening these days. And we do have some money to help support that through some of the federal funds that Teresa was talking about, the more general American Reconstruction Plan Act funds. We have some money to support some of those incentives for rural remote workers. So I'll just have you move on to the next slide. The other thing that the Rural Opportunity Team did is they got a roadmap grant in conjunction with DOLA. DOLA is kind of the lead agency, and we're partnering with them, and we're doing strategies for a set of rural communities to help them think through and plan for their diversification. And how do they utilize these remote work opportunities? And we know that broadband is really high on the list as an enabling technology. And we're going to go through this whole process of planning and analysis and support for these rural communities to determine what the right solutions are to promote economic vitality, diversification, and remote rural work. So you're going to see, in fact, you saw last week, there was an announcement of who some of those focus communities are across Colorado. So be aware of that through our rural opportunity team as well. We'll go to the next slide. This is what I was talking about earlier. We call it our lone worker incentive. This is where we give you an extra incentive if you're coming in and hiring net new employees in Colorado. We give you a tax credit typically for that, but also we'll give you an extra cash incentive if those net new employees are hired in rural locations. And then we have other rural incentives as well, like Rural Jumpstart, which is a program where there's often a collaboration between an institution of higher education and a new business or new business unit in rural Colorado, and we can give tax credits and grants to some of those companies as well. And again, that relies on strong broadband connectivity. And some of the companies that have actually taken advantage of our lone worker, remote rural worker incentives, PAX8, which a Denver IT company that are hiring in multiple places in rural Colorado, including Grand Junction and Fremont County. And this company In Focus, but the S is a 5. It's based out of Telluride, and they've moved several jobs from California to Grand Junction, so leveraging that location neutral worker incentive. So we hope to see more of those kinds of activities. So we'll keep going. And then there's also a community marketing grant available to help communities market themselves to these remote rural workers. And I know, it's interesting, when we started this program, we were still in this dynamic pre-COVID, and, there was a lot of energy and dynamism in central cities and not as much in rural communities. And I think, with COVID, a lot of people have moved to rural communities, either part-time or full-time. So it's a chance to sort of continue leveraging those benefits and marketing yourself to remote rural workers. It's a small grant. And again, we appreciate our partners. You'll see a theme. I've mentioned DOLA a number of times. They're really our sister agency. As Greg knows, we work together all the time on various initiatives, and DOLA helped us co-fund this program. So we really partner with DOLA. They are sort of probably our closest agency that we work with outside of the governor's office, daily basis. So DOLA is a great partner and great supporter in all these initiatives. And then I just mentioned Just Transition, and I think that's the, if you go back one slide or a couple slides, and it's the Just Transition program, you all know, is part of CDLE. And I just thought it was worth mentioning that is really a core part of just the state of Colorado's rural strategy. How do we help our coal communities diversify? Places like Nuclear and Natarita, the west end of Montrose, parts of the Eastern Plains, the Yampa Valley, sort of broadly speaking, all the way into places like Moffett County and Craig, as well as Routt County. Economic diversification in those communities will really rely on broadband. So, if it's important for a normal communities that are going to have dislocation from coal power plants or coal mining or other resource industries sort of slowing down and going away, I think broadband is even more critical. And I think many of you probably noticed in Delta that a really great strategy, at least as an interim strategy in terms of redeploying coal workers, they often are really good at laying broadband cables. And that's not that, eventually that work will run out, but it's actually a nice sort of interim transition step to actually take some of those coal workers who have high skills and are good with their hands, and having them actually help build out our broadband networks can be really powerful. So I think we've seen that in the past, and I've got the example there in the North Fork Valley with Lightworks, and that was really, I think, got a lot of attention a couple of years ago when they started that program. So there's an interesting even interim nexus to build broadband with some of these workers. So Just Transition is really important to keep our eye on. And then I'll just talk briefly about what does OEDIT actually do to support broadband. And so, like I said, we're small compared to some of our sister agencies in this, but you might have heard of the Enterprise Zone program. If you go to our website, which is choosecolorado.com, and you do /EZ, it'll take you to our Enterprise Zone map. But there's 16 designated zones around the state. Most of them are rural zones. There are also some urban distress zones as well. And you get state income tax credits for making certain kinds of investments in enterprise zones. And the biggest program and the sort of most direct supporter of sort of broadband and telecommunications infrastructure investment is called the investment tax credit. And I'll just have you flip to the next page on this. And just to give you a little bit of flavor, and looks like that slide, I apologize, might have not come through too well, at least on my screen. But but I can still kind of give you the highlights of it. Basically, the investment tax credit, if you invest in business personal property in an enterprise zone, oh, thanks for fixing that. You get 3% of your actual qualified investment in business personal property. So not real estate, not buildings, but things like cables and telecom switches and fiber optics do count. You get 3% of your investment back as a state income tax credit. And generally companies can take a $750,000 credit a year, and then they can carry that forward for multiple years once they make those investments. So you can see in terms of, this is not the 3%, this is the actual capital investments that have been incentivized by enterprise zones. And I gave you some data over multiple years. And you can see, it's in that $165 million range over the past few years. And by the way, the reason 2020 is such a small number is we don't have the credits tend to get certified well after the fact. So we don't really have the full 2020 data yet. I would expect that would at least be in the $50 million range or more in 20, even though COVID slowed things down, it wouldn't slow things down that much. So 2020 is an incomplete number. A better sense is probably in that $60 to $100 million a year range of investments that are incentivized. And so there's really a few big players here, and this is all publicly available data. But if you could think of, the sort of bigger private telecom publicly traded companies, each invest tens of millions of dollars every year in enterprise zones across all of their different telecom infrastructure that are incentivized. But what we'd say is, because these are rural communities, that a bunch of the small rural co-ops all over the state also do get these tax credits as well. From their broadband investments. So you can kind of just get a flavor of who some of the carriers are and the amount of money that gets these enterprise zone investment tax credits. That's probably our biggest incentive that directly incentivizes the investment in telecom infrastructure. It's not really the core of our role as an economic development entity, but I just want you to be aware of that program and that those tax credits do happen and do get issued every year. So I'll take you to the next slide, opportunity zones. And this is its whole own world. But under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, under the Trump administration, part of that tax reform package was the Opportunity Zone program. It was a bipartisan program, and it's designed to incentivize long-term private sector investments in areas that are designated low-income communities by giving investors that meet a series of requirements, including holding their investment for the long term and substantially improving the properties they invest in. It allows them to forego and delay capital gains tax. So it's sort of incentive. It's not a state income tax like the enterprise zone. It's a foregoing capital gains tax, and that's the basic premise. And it's been operating for several years now, and there's been talk that we can use it to incentivize broadband investments. It's a census tract by census tract designation. So one challenge for broadband is if there aren't a bunch of contiguous tracts that are all part of the opportunity zones, a carrier might say, well, I don't want you to incentivize one piece but not another. The nice thing about rural Colorado is because they're not densely populated areas, the census tracts are geographically bigger. So they typically try and include several thousand people in a tract. So you might think of some of our counties that don't even have several thousand people. So the whole county might be a tract. So in that sense, some of our zones are fairly big geographically, and so they are pretty contiguous geographic areas. So those could work for a broadband investment. But I'll have you go to the next slide. It gives a little bit more information on the mechanics of opportunity zones. And I'm not going to go through this, but it's not a trivial act. You have to structure a fund the right way. You have to invest at the right time. You have to hold it for the right length of time. And so it really is typically something that sophisticated investors do in our structure, and they set it up through experts in accounting and legal fields. But the beauty is if you do build something and hold it and exit after 10 years, you can basically eliminate your capital gains from that investment. So the thought is, could this work for not just a real estate investment or a classic business investment, but also for some kind of an infrastructure investment? So that's so that's the basics of an OZ. I'll just take you one more slide forward. And then, so this is what do we do about opportunity zones? And I think you guys noticed that Mike Landis was on the original presentation with me. He's out on vacation. He works on my team. He's our opportunity zone director. And we have sort of a whole series of technical assistance that the state provides to support opportunity zones. We worked really intensively with local communities for the first couple of years. after opportunity zones were announced so that they could develop prospectuses to try and attract investment. And we have a grant program that can actually help developers and communities structure projects and try and make them attractive for investors. And we do have a program that's had a couple rounds of applicants where we'll actually support businesses that are trying to raise capital through opportunity zones by giving them intensive technical assistance and coaching. That's our Oz Capital Accelerator program. And we will have a new set of applications into a new cohort for that program, probably in the next couple of months. And then we just have generally done a lot of educating investors and community leaders, stakeholders, developers about how opportunity zones invest. And then Colorado did create kind of a, it's a little bit of a matchmaking website. It's called coloradoinvest.com. It's got a couple of other names. And basically, investors can register if they're interested in talking to projects. Projects can register if they're interested in talking to investors and developers. And you can search, it's a database. And we've gotten pretty good activity in terms of the number of projects that could be opportunity zone projects and investors registered on this website. So it's a way to help and do some matchmaking. We have the right disclaimers that the SEC requires so that they don't say that you're trying to solicit investments illegally on that website. We just we're a neutral information provider on that website. That's some of the support we've done for the opportunity zones. And if you want to see our opportunity zone program, our opportunity zone website and our map, in this, you'll see down below the map on this slide, those yellow areas are opportunity zones. You can see in the metro area, the tracks are small, so you can't really see the yellow areas, but this is where in some of the rural areas, we either have a single tract or multiple tracts together cover big geographic areas. So it could be helpful for an investor who's investing in a region, for example. And if you want to see our opportunity zone map, there's a bunch of federal maps that show every state out there. But if you go to choosecolorado.com/OZ, as opposed to EZ, which is enterprise zones, you can see this map and you can search on addresses and locations to see if something's in a zone. And Mike has organized several conversations and meetings. He's worked with people like Teresa. We've worked with we had a conference with the Ute Mountain Ute, and we also had conversations with the Southern Ute about opportunities on investments in broadband. And here's a couple of the conversations we've had about trying to attract broadband funding in places like Colorado and some other sister states. So these are some of the conversations that we've had. I don't think we've got any final deals to report yet, but we think OZs could be a good tool to stimulate that private investment. So then we'll go to the next slide. And this is Cdbg infrastructure assistance. And, DOLA has a whole series of programs to the Department of Local Government and through the Housing Division to deploy Cdbg. I mentioned Allison Anderson. She coordinates a series of revolving loan funds that are spread each in the different regions of Colorado. And they give funding for business development in non-entitlement areas. And most of the funds that Allison works with, the big majority provide revolving loans, sort of gap financing when businesses can't get all the capital they need from a bank, particularly if it's things like working capital. These local revolving loan funds can fund it through contracts with DOLA. However, one of the other things that they can do is they can give infrastructure grants to local governments, always to local governments. Now, if it's a general infrastructure grant, it goes through the DOLA division of local government. So they might do everything from sewers and waters and water things. But if there's a very specific business that needs infrastructure to enable the creation of specific low to moderate income jobs, some of that CDB infrastructure assistance will occasionally flow through these local revolving loan funds and through Allison Anderson. So like if you're going to build a factory that needs anything from sidewalks to electrical infrastructure, sometimes roads, rail spurs even, and could include broadband infrastructure, it has to be owned by the local government. Right, so we won't just give this to a business, but we can build infrastructure on behalf of a local government to help with a job expansion project that serves a specific quantified number of low to moderate income individuals. So this is kind of a rare circumstance when we've used this to do broadband. I can only think of one example, I think, where that's occurred, but it is a tool. If we've got a specific job, a specific business build out that needs broadband, that this is a possible tool that gets coordinated through OEDIT. But again, it's funded by our sisters in DOLA. So I just wanted to mention that program. The next slide, I think, lists some of the various types of infrastructure And again, there is the occasional possibility of telecommunications infrastructure, again, by the local government, and often the need for matching funds and the improvements in the infrastructure do have to be sort of adopted and maintained by a public entity or a quasi-public entity. So that's the only other way I could think about us actually directly helping to fund infrastructure or broadband projects. So that's kind of the recap of OEDIT. We really need broadband for all of our rural communities for our diversification and economic development strategies, and we are a small contributor to incentivize and help fund some of these broadband investments. Happy to chat with you guys and hear any ideas and suggestions you have.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was great. I'm going to open it up to the board members now. Any questions? Anything we'd like to discuss and share?
So Jeff, just a comment from Mrs. Antonio. So also at the Action 22, they did point out that across the rural counties, the housing market is just as bad as it is here on the Front Range. It's not only your program incentivizing, but just the fact that a lot of these companies have allowed their employees to work remotely as long as they had speeds has taken to hit their housing markets very hard. And they're also seeing the same types of issues we're seeing here on the Front Range, where there are investors out there buying properties. And so the rural growth is real. And so I'm glad you have this program, but I'm not sure that we need to continue to incentivize when the feedback we're getting from the counties is that they don't have the infrastructure to support it. For example, there was a housing build out proposal that was going to be done down in my neck of the woods in Pinellas County, and they had to cancel it altogether because they didn't have water infrastructure built in place yet. So it's great to incentivize people to go rural, but we got to remember that rural can't necessarily support all the growth that's already taking place right now.
Yeah, it's a good point, Antonio, and I appreciate you bringing that up. And what I would say is, we don't do a top-down incentivization. We look for local communities to step up and say we want this growth. So we really do take our cues from local, and I think there's not a single community in Colorado that isn't feeling housing strains. And frankly, even before COVID switched the dynamic, there's a lot of rural communities that haven't had much housing investment in recent years, so they didn't have a lot of excess housing. So it is a challenge across Colorado. I think the growth is coming, and we have to prepare for it. And the other piece is, particularly in some of these communities that are relying on a single industry or tourism reliant, and if you're a just transition community, you can't start that economic diversification when the pain hits. You have to start, as early as possible to drive that diversification. So it's a balancing act. But I agree, we do take the lead from our local communities. There's many local communities that say, we don't want it. We don't want, growth. We don't want your help on this diversification. And we don't put those incentives out there if the local communities don't want them. So really play in consultation with the local communities. And it'll be interesting to see, how the market dynamics, change and shift going forward. The pendulum seems to be a long-term pendulum. There's a trend towards centralization of resources in urban areas, and then eventually that pendulum shifts back, and it has to do with federal policy and a lot of different perspectives. And it seems like we could be, to your point, in the potential beginning of a long swing where there's a little bit more momentum and energy in rural Colorado. So we'll just have to stay nimble on that regard, and we do focus our incentives so that they're community driven and community led, and we don't incentivize programs or projects that the local communities don't ask for their help on. So I think it's a really good point. And I will say the other thing that, this gets into sort of a broader conversation, but one of the things that we've been working really hard on, and we probably incentivized 6 or 7 manufactured housing technology companies that are dispersed around local Colorado's, because, as all these supply chain constraints have occurred and you can't get lumber from Canada at any kind of a reasonable price, and there's labor shortages, are there ways to make really nice housing through manufactured products? And so we do have companies throughout Colorado that both OEDIT and DOLA have worked on putting in place that can hopefully start to take care of some of these housing demand questions as well, because these things are all intertwined. Housing, economic development, government resources, they're all sort of kissing cousins of the same coin, for sure.
Great, thank you for that, Jeff. Is there anything else? Anyone else have any questions?
Brian, I don't have a question, but I do have a statement. I wanted to thank Jeff for his team's support of broadband. You guys really have, Mike has been great working with to focus on broadband, and you're right, the announcements haven't been made yet, but we think there's going to be some really exciting things coming from the cross-pollination with OEDIT and your focus, understanding that, this can't happen. Most of your initiatives can't happen without broadband, right? To bring that to Main Street, Colorado. Most of those communities do need broadband connectivity to just continue to thrive in their environment and in today's economy. So yeah, I loved you bringing up the transition of coal miners in DMEA. That was wonderful. They're also seeing that same expansion of job training, expanded job opportunities up in Yampa Valley, in Routt and Moffat County that are coal impacted, as you identified as well. So really excited about some of these synergistic efforts that are bringing the communities that want to move forward in this direction the resources they need to do so. So thanks for highlighting those, and we appreciate your partnership across agencies in that regard.
Thanks, Teresa.
Right, okay. Unless there's any other comments, I will just say this, we're about to adjourn, but I believe this is my last meeting on the Broadband Advisory Board. I will be transitioning over to OIT, the Colorado Broadband Office, next month. So someone else from DORA will be appointed, but just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity, and I've enjoyed it and look forward to continuing to work with you all in different ways. So other than that, unless Sarah or anyone else has anything to add, I can adjourn the meeting.
Thank you. I'm done. I have nothing to add.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Take care, and good luck to you. Bye-bye.
Hi, Brian.